Welcome everybody to the launch of the Routledge Companion to Crime Fiction. My name is Stuart King and I am one of the editors of the Companion, and my apologies for the late start to this launch. Obviously organising a book launch across 3 time zones was beyond us. Now, before I introduce the other speakers, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands we begin this book launch. I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. With me this morning is, or this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending upon where you are in the world, are my co-editors, Janice Allen, Jesper Guldal, and Andrew Pepper. And to formally launch the book, we are joined by Carolyn Reitz, the executive editor of Clues. We're each going to say a few words before we pass over the microphone, so to speak, to Caroline to launch the book. Now, if you have any questions, please use the chat function, and if we have time, we'll try to respond to them at the end. First, Janice would like to say a few words about one of our contributors, Neil McCall, who sadly died before the book was published. Janice.
Thank you very much, Stuart. So some of you may know Neil McCall sadly passed away in March 2020, aged only 50 years and only 2 months after his inaugural lecture at Winchester University, where he spent his entire career from undergraduate through to Professor of Victorian Literature and Culture. Neil is probably best known amongst this particular circle for his monograph, Adapting Detective Fiction, published in 2012. But as significant as his research is and will continue to be, it's really his generosity as a scholar and indeed a human being that I'd like to pay tribute to tonight. If you never had the opportunity to see Neil in action, I strongly recommend watching his inaugural, which is available on YouTube, in which he's talking about Sherlock Holmes as the world's first superhero. You know, it's Neil all over. He's sitting on a desk and it's like he's chatting to his friends in the pub, and you get that sort of self-deprecating humor along with the extraordinary insight and that really engaging style of communication that characterizes all of Neil's work. I had the pleasure to work with Neil on 2 projects, the Cambridge Companion to Sherlock Holmes, and again, this companion, which sadly he didn't actually get the chance to see. You know, he was the dream contributor. He produced everything to time, to order. When we asked for changes, he responded with incredible good grace about the whole thing. But my abiding memory of Neil actually relates to a project that I had to pull out of because of my own period of ill health on my part. And it wasn't simply that Neil was generous about that, reminding me that good health is more important than any publication, but that he offered to step in and cover other commitments for me, despite being so busy himself and indeed a professional rather than a personal friend. I really wish that I had had the opportunity to get to know him better and to work with him more and more often than I did. But to finish this very brief tribute, I'd like to read a passage from Neil's 2008 children's novel. I don't know if you know that, but he did write a children's novel called My Dad the Crab, and it seems particularly apposite for today's occasion. The words are spoken by the novel's 9-year-old narrator, Alex Brian Wilson. And he says, I like lots of things and I have lots of hobbies. I like collecting stuff and making stuff and reading about stuff and writing down everything that I've learned. I like trying to work things out that I don't understand. Mysteries, they're called. I love mysteries more than anything else in the whole world. Thanks very much.
Oh, that was a lovely tribute. Thank you, Janice. The idea for the Companion began in 2017 when Polly Dodson at Routledge contacted Jesper and me and asked if we would be interested in submitting a proposal for the Companion. Jesper and I had organised a seminar at the on worlding crime fiction at the ACLA conference in Utrecht, and Polly liked our international approach. Polly's invitation provided us with an opportunity to break down what we saw as the traditional distinction between Anglo-American and international crime fiction. And it also offered us an opportunity to acknowledge and to promote the innovative scholarship that we believe is taking place in crime fiction studies beyond the Anglosphere. Too often, I think there is an assumption that innovation lies in the Anglo-American genre and scholarship on it, and that critics working on other crime fiction traditions only or mainly contribute to their own discipline and not to the broader crime fiction scholarly community. So with this companion, we wanted to create a dialogue between scholars working on different national traditions, and we encourage them where possible to illustrate their discussions with non-Anglophone or peripheral Anglophone examples. And I'm very pleased that the companion includes case studies from Africa, Asia, Australia, North and South America, and of course, Europe. I think the collection is much stronger for it. And if we have contributed to furthering a transnational dialogue between scholars, then I'm very pleased with what we have achieved. I'll now pass it on to Jesper to say a few words.
Thanks very much, Stuart. I'm just going to say a couple of things about the structure of the book. When setting out to design the Routledge Companion to Crime Fiction, we knew, of course, that there was already a number of companions and introductions to crime fiction on the market, and we wanted to make sure that the book was distinctive, that it did something different and something new. And Stuart has already talked about one of the two major editorial principles of this volume, which is the inclusion of texts and scholars from around the world, in recognition that crime fiction today is a genuinely global phenomenon. And the other principle was to ask each author to include a substantial 1,000-word case study in their contribution. We did that because of a sense that some of the existing introductory work in crime fiction studies tends to go for breadth and coverage, drawing on lots of different examples, but saying relatively little about each of them. But in crime fiction, if you don't look closely, you might only see the conventional aspects of the text, but not the innovative and individual aspects, those that truly challenge our understanding of the genre. Now, 1,000 words is not a lot, of course, but it's a whole lot more than a few general sentences. And it does allow, that's our hope at least, that it allows a use of the text that's not purely illustrative, but also works as a nuanced reading, and perhaps even shows some of the tensions of the chapter topic. So global breadth and textual depth, those were our main editorial principles. I want to round off my part by talking briefly about the structure of the book, the actual structure of the book, and our selection of topics as well. Again, we wanted to do something different here, and we specifically wanted to avoid the heavy genre focus that you see in some of the existing handbook literature. The focus on successive crime fiction formats, such as the police procedure or the whodunit, the hardboiled, etc., etc. It's not a polemical point I'm making here, by the way. Genre is obviously very important, and that's why the book opens with a chapter on that topic. But our hope was that by organizing the field in a different way, we might be able to open up new perspectives in crime fiction studies and also new ways of thinking about genre. So the Routledge Companion is divided into three sections: approaches, devices, and interfaces. The first section, approaches, is dedicated to a range of theoretical issues in contemporary crime fiction studies, including, just to pick out a few examples, transnationality, the crime fiction marketplace, and world literature. The second, devices, breaks up crime fiction into its constitutive elements, focusing on, for example, the beginning and the ending, place, and paratextuality. And the last section, interfaces, focuses on the ways in which crime fiction connects with the contemporary world. The titles of the chapters in this final section all have the same format: crime fiction and X. The point we wanted to make here is, of course, that crime fiction is not just light entertainment and not just genre fiction, but a lens of sorts that enables us to observe and understand through narrative some of the things that are going on in our contemporary world. Migration, for example, or trauma, or crimes relating to global capital, the environment, or new digital technologies. So, of course, if the book has any real quality, as we hope, it's due to the strength of all the individual contributions, not to the editorial principles. But we do hope that our design of this book makes it not just useful, but also opens up new ways of thinking about the crime genre. And with that, I might hand back to Janice. Thanks.
Right. I wanted to speak tonight about how far the study of crime fiction has come. And I intended to use my 10 odd years as executive editor of Clues to do that. But when I tried, I seemed to be coming up with lists and it didn't feel particularly appropriate. So instead, forgive me, I'm going to tell you a story. I went to university to be an English major. That was my absolute dream. But one lackluster professor later, I found myself unexpectedly in the Department of Comparative Literature. Now, in accordance with the unwritten laws that allowed those two departments to coexist in a kind of uneasy state of truce, the canon was strictly off limits to me. Only English majors studied the so-called greats. I, on the other hand, had the kind of anarchic pleasures and freedom of everything else, from world literature to obscure 18th century travel writers to Ukrainian folktales. There was nothing that was off limits to me. And what that meant, of course, was that the divide between canonical and non-canonical, between a so-called high and low, structured first my education and more abidingly my research. But the one moment that really crystallized for me the power of the canon, of classification, the one moment that to this day I use to measure how far the study of crime fiction and popular fiction more generally has come, was my MA Viva in the late 80s, it would have been. All you need to know was that my dissertation was about the representation and misreading of rape scenes in English language and French language romance novels. So I was sat across the table from four male white examiners, and the external pushed my dissertation, a copy of my dissertation, across the table to me, and written on the title page in really thick black marker, I'm talking, really, really chunky letters, was the statement, "Harlequin romances are bull like McDonald's and hot dogs." That was the start of my MA Viva. And they then persisted to question me about Jane Austen, I think the closest thing they could imagine to a romance novel, for the next 2 hours. And the notion that I had approached my subject with intellectual purpose, with critical rigor, was to them inconceivable. The fact that I had engaged in close readings of what they referred to me in that Viva as trash was laughable. As laughable, in fact, as what I could see in retrospect was the fact that I never anticipated the need to defend my subject as well as my argument. More than 30 years later, we get to this volume, which, as Jasper has just sort of tried to, has just very ably explained, this volume, which in its very structure and intent refuses to be bound by the past, remains silent on questions of literary value. Check the index, no reference to canon, popular, high, low. It's not in there. Which moves beyond genres and subgenres as, the only interpretive framework available, and instead emphasizes the complexities, the nuances of individual texts, which reads crime fiction on and in its own terms and without the hint of apology. That volume, for me, represents just how far we have come across the course of my career. Of course, many people in the room and many people I hope watching tonight were our trailblazers, and many other contributors were our future and are our future. But before I hand over to Andrew to sketch out what that future might look like, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the role that Clues played in that journey, both generally and as part of the origin story of this collection. I remember when Stephen Knight got in touch with me in 2012, 2013 to talk about the idea of a special edition on global crime scenes. I thought, yeah, that sounds really interesting. But it wasn't until I read Stuart's essay on crime fiction as world literature that I fully appreciated just how groundbreaking that approach would be. I remember at the time I wrote to Stuart and said something along the lines of, this is one of my favorite ever essays to have seen in Clues. This is going to change everything. And indeed it has. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's very kind. Andrew.
Yes, just unmuting myself. Thank you very much for, all speakers so far and for everyone joining, watching. I said I'd say something about the state of the discipline and perhaps about crime fiction itself in 2021. But having set myself this task, it sort of struck me in my own thoughts on the subject are a good deal narrower and less interesting than those offered by the collection. Now, crime fiction studies might now be recognized, obviously, as a legitimate area of academic inquiry. I remember the sneering accusations, thinking of Janice's story there, of literary slumming in the mid-90s when I said I was writing my own PhD on American crime fiction. Whether it counts as a discipline is another issue, I suppose. Certainly sort of it encompasses and moves between so many disciplinary markers, as the essays here attest to: literary studies, linguistics, translation, languages, film and TV studies, history, politics, criminology, law, and even the hard sciences. If this disciplinary restlessness, I think, is one marker of the essays in the collection, another would be a refusal to fix what crime fiction is. Just as crime fiction moves between discrete disciplines, crime fiction can't be contained by uniform understandings of its core features, or, to use the terminology of the collection, its devices. When is a murderer not a murderer, a criminal not a criminal, a victim not a victim, a detective not a detective? Or when they're in a crime story, of course, as we see in essays here, is insofar as each of these roles blur, overlap, converge, and depart from one another. From the companion, we see the geographical expansiveness of the genre, as Stuart was talking about, and the variousness of its forms, no longer just print fiction, but also long-form TV, graphic novels, and new digital platforms. Nor is crime fiction reducible to a set of straightforward generic designations: detective, spy fiction, procedural, noir, police, psychological thriller, or true crime narratives. And as the boundaries fray and become ever more porous, crime fiction encroaches on other genres and vice versa: SF, horror, war, sci-fi, fantasy, melodrama, and speculative fiction. The global reach of the genre and its increasingly restlessness and its hybridization, both subjects addressed in the companion, are linked, I think, in far-reaching ways. So as the genre breaks new territories spatially and politically, it assumes new forms. We've known this for a while, obviously. The undoing and remaking of the genre according to the imperatives of race, gender, class, and sexuality is an ongoing concern for many of the contributors. Just as the studies of the genre explore the consequences and the ambivalences of racial stereotyping, or repressed desire, or colonial inheritance, the most canonical of writers are reimagined in new and fascinating ways. And so essays by Rawls, Plain, Bernthal, for example, find the same emphasis on breakdown, subversion, ambiguity, the kind of nuance that Janice was talking about there in Christie and Sayers, as Valerani ascribes to China Mayville, or Heather Human to Lafferty and Stig Larsson. And the most written about author in the collection, well, that would be Agatha Christie, I think, by some margin. Not perhaps what I would have expected from a companion committed to staking out new paradigms, new understandings of crime fiction. But then my expectations are a product of my prejudices, and my prejudices, I think, have been well and truly exposed here. The sense of, kind of, what the fuck do I know anyway, is one of the most satisfying parts, I think, of being involved in a project like this. Because among many other things, it's made me look at things I suppose I've taken for granted or ignored or missed, kind of the contributions and the framing comments of my co-editors. It's shaken me out of my own complacencies. So finally, well, why do we read and study crime fiction in 2021? Well, perhaps for some of the same reasons that people turned to the genre in the 19th and 20th centuries, for its complex characterizations, its wrangling with narrative and plot, realism, social justice, power, and the city, as the excellent essays here make clear. But perhaps also because the subject of our study and the frameworks we bring to bear on this study are never static, and we must move with them or die. And periodically, I think we get stuck in what we do, finding reassurance in the familiar grooves of our well-worn critical inquiries. So to think of this companion maybe as a way to get unstuck, maybe the most useful insight I can offer. So I think I'll leave it there. So back to you, Stuart.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Carolyn Wright, who I said before is the executive editor of Clues, to formally launch the book. So thank you very much, Caroline.
Thank you, Stuart. And I just would say to both Janice and Andrew's comments, when I turned in my dissertation proposal many years ago to do a dissertation on detective fiction, I was warned by my entire committee not to ghettoize my project, and that I really needed to be able to say whatever I was going to say about Bleak House and Middlemarch. Like, I could read the detective fiction, but it has to be applicable to Bleak House and Middlemarch. And also just to continue doing the good work that Janice was doing at Clues on an upcoming special issue on historical mysteries, it was very notable that it wasn't just a particular national history or tradition. It's a historical mystery issue, but about the history and the way that the genre is responding to history really in a global sense. And that was not part of the call for papers. That was just where the conversation is right now. And so I think it's just incredibly exciting. It is an honor to be here in this morning/afternoon/evening, which illustrates in approximately 50 characters how truly global the field of crime fiction is. Thanks to Janice and Jesper, Stuart, and Andrew for inviting me and for this marvelous companion. I have been getting up to speed this year as the new editor of Clues, and I have been preparing also an edition of Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of the Four for Oxford World Classics. And I've been teaching Sign of the Four for almost 30 years. In some ways, we have grown up together. While I knew way back in grad school that the representation of Tonga was messed up, I had no idea about Mary Morstan's latent possibilities until I saw this angel of the house become a professional assassin on BBC Sherlock. So thank you, adaptations. In the time that I've been thinking deeply about that text, I have shifted from seeing it as a classic to being more in line with the troubled monuments falling in both this country and beyond. While I do not think that Sign of the Four should fall, as I have taught it over the years, more and more work goes into contextualizing it, whether it is about the mutiny/rebellion/First War of Independence, or unpacking the reification of Western rationality in the figure of the great detective himself. In a recent seminar I taught on the year 1890, in my urban classroom, we groaned under the weight of this necessary contextualization. So reading the Routledge Companion to Crime Fiction and listening to its editors and contributors talk about it today, its dizzying array of primary sources, contexts, scholars, and big ideas is a balm to my soul, if admittedly the font was a challenge to my aging eyes. It was like zooming out, getting a Google Earth view of the genre and its hybridities, entanglements, long-standing hangups, and newly envisioned possibilities. This companion clearly demonstrates crime fiction's commitment to being in process, rather than chaining itself to a rock of inherent conservatism, a cherished critical belief, if not toppled, then reframed here by dozens of thought-provoking, culturally competent plaques. While Sign of the Four gets a couple mentions, I See You, Champa Roy, and Sherlock Holmes wanders through these pages, it feels liberating to have him as one tributary of a vast and rapidly moving river. Here were fascinating reframings of the Todorov two-step. Kate Quinn reads Todorow's famous discussion of the dual narratives of the investigation in the present and the story of the crime in the past in light of multidirectional memory. And Cynthia Hamilton locates crime fiction in a multidirectional approach to trauma. From radical geography to global capital, contributors make manifest the rich interdisciplinary globe-trotting conversations that are taking place in this fiction and in the scholarship. I was especially intrigued to see how the companion on both a formal and conceptual level illustrates how crime fiction moves between part and whole. The chapters allow a dive into particulars, digital technology, translation, victims, murder, while also making manifest that such movement is a foundational logic of crime fiction itself. Patrick Deere talks in his chapter on crime fiction and war, for example, about a metonymic exploration across genres. The energy of the relationship between part and whole reverberates across a genre that generates long-standing series around individual sleuths, innovates serial characters embedded in larger periodicals, and uncovers multinational crimes from a single clue. I think I've spent about $650 on used crime novels in the month-long course of reading this. There is such a wonderful, I'm not going to say canon because that would be completely undermining to the point of it, but a sense of the texts that are really shaping the conversations in this field. My shopping cart groans in a good way under the weight of this thought-provoking collection. If a single book were tasked with energizing us as readers, scholars, fans, and teachers, to say nothing as inhabitants of a global culture pinging wildly between structural violence and hope, it could do no better than this one. So I take my deerstalker hat off to the editors, to the almost 50 contributors, and to the folks at Routledge for creating an intellectual community and a space for us to meet, even as we are variously isolated across the world. Indeed, we're all parts working in our various time zones, and this companion unites us in conversation. I look forward to meeting you in places in the after times, to seeing your future scholarship in the pages of Clues, and to reading some of your wonderful books, which are now sitting in my shopping cart. So congratulations to everyone. And if you were a ship, I would break a champagne bottle on you, but I'll just say cheers. And thank you for inviting me, and terrific job on this fascinating work.
Well, cheers. Thank you very much, Caroline. That was it was very pleasing as an editor to hear your overview of what we've done and see what we tried to realize with the collection. Jesper's informed me we don't have any questions yet. If anybody would like to send a question through, please do so. If you don't want to ask a question now, we're all available online, and you can contact us very easily, and or you could send a question later, and we'll happily respond. But we've got Caroline's put her hand up. So.
Well, one question that I had when I was reading this, and this is really a question for the four of you in terms of maybe the origin of where you drew the boundaries. So if one of the things that just is a clear takeaway from this volume is the hybridity, the lack of an investment in there being particular categories, sort of an anti-John Coelty, if you will, which is, I always think of him as that sort of stickler of the critical tradition. Did you feel like there is any categorization that needed to remain when you thought about this? And I think about this just sort of a little bit in terms of thinking about crime fiction syllabi. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you might know what needed to be on it, what would count as a sort of starter set kind of conversation about these things. And the range and the excitement of your companion sort of explodes that, and for all good reasons. But I was wondering if there was anything when you were thinking about this that you wanted to remain as essential to what we're talking about when we talk about crime fiction.
Jesper, do you want to have a response, or Andrew? Mute.
Yes, I mean, I suppose, while those sort of traditional, you expect in a companion, don't you, to sort of see something on, the hard-boiled or the classical detective story or the police procedural. And I suppose elements of those things are here. So, there's a chapter on the police, or, something that's looking at kind of, psychoanalysis, perhaps rather than the sort of, psychological thriller. or looking at noir, but instead of looking at kind of noir, looking at kind of ideas of affect. So sort of, some of those sort of, kind of traditional markers are here, but sort of, kind of reframed, for I think exactly the same reasons that you were talking about. So, we don't fall back into, those sort of assumptions about the sanctity and fixity of those kind of forms or subgenres or whatever they are, and to acknowledge the moves that constantly take place between them, between them and between other kind of markers of, kind of genre and other genres as well.
Janice or Jesper, do you have?
What I would say is I don't remember any of us as a team having conversations saying, no, that's off limits, that's off bounds. I think we were a bit concerned where, there was this Agatha Christie kept coming up. But what I would say about that is the discussions of Agatha Christie actually render Agatha Christie new. They defamiliarize her and actually show you a new kind of approach to Agatha Christie. And you see her in such a different light that it still felt really, really fresh rather than actually going back. It just felt like a reinvention. So I quite enjoyed that. I mean, we really did encourage people to kind of push the boat out and bring in as many authors from across the world as absolutely possible, but we didn't feel we were losing anything when they went back to the familiars, because they did it in such an intelligent and innovative way.
I'm not sure I have all that much to add here, but I'm sure our collection has its blind spots, and I guess it's for a future team of editors of a companion in 10, 15 years time to sort of expose those. And we will then, sit back, in embarrassment. But our fundamental principles, and I've talked about them already, are the idea of the ideas of global outlook and textual insight, and that's fundamental to us. Just to answer your question, Caroline, and I guess that was a limit that we wanted to defend. As it were, but other than that, I fully agree that nothing was off the table. I think that's a good way of describing it. I don't want to end that part of the discussion, but I can tell you that we have a few comments now. Andrea Goulet says bravo to the editors, which is very kind. Thank you, Andrea. And Christiana Gregoriou says congratulations to everyone. That's good. Andrew Nestigen says, it's a brilliant contribution. Thanks for your excellent work. A question, even with it being so big, what did you have to leave out?
This, can I just answer that for a second? Because it leads to what I was going to say. I do remember that there was one exclusion. Quite early on, we decided that we wanted to focus on fiction, on crime fiction. We have a chapter on, an excellent chapter on adaptation, of course, but we believe we didn't want to just add an extra chapter on crime film, film noir or TV shows. That crime TV and crime and film noir and crime film has become such a large there is such a large body of work, and it deserves its own companion, really. We did not just want to do something tokenistic on that, in that area. So that was that's what I remember being our only exclusion.
But having said it's exclusion, you remember Andrew's essay, looking at the police, and we decided there that sort of, because of all the kind of, sort of rich work being done on television around the police procedural, kind of, up to the wire, we couldn't exclude that on sort of, those terms. So, there was a degree of, kind of adaptability, or sort of, that we had to sort of go along with, kind of along the way.
Oh, and Paul Cobley's chapter as well, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
No, well, anybody else have anything to say about what we may have left out deliberately? No, as Jesper said, obviously, there are blind spots. There are things that are not in there, and that will be for a future companion to address. Obviously, I'd just like
there were the essays that we didn't actually get in the end. that we were hoping for.
True, yeah.
Yeah, the names there will remain, unremarked on, because it was going to be a 50 essay volume, wasn't it?
Originally, yes, yeah. Yeah, it's what happens, of course, in a massive undertaking like this. Just as we finish, I'd just like to reiterate the point that Jesper made in his talk, to really thank the contributors for their collection, for their contribution to this collection. We had an idea for what we wanted to see, and the contributors realised that in spades, and sometimes taking us in directions that we weren't necessarily expecting. And so, the strength of this collection is really down to the quality of those contributions. So, to those contributors who are watching us and who have thanked us, likewise, we thank you. And on that note, I think we can bring our launch to an end. Congratulations, everybody. Thank you.